By the time the first frost silvered the Devil's Club along the creek, Ray Reynolds had already stacked 2 cords of fur under tarp. 3 rows deep and squared so clean, a quarter would balance on the top splits. It was the kind of thing nobody saw and nobody praised, which was exactly why he liked doing it. At 68, with a left knee that clicked in damp weather and a shoulder that still twinged where a static line had snapped him hard in 1989, he moved slower than he used to. Not softer, just slower. He had spent 31 seasons jumping smoke into steep country with a saw strapped to his thigh and a map case beating his chest, and he had learned the difference between hurry and waste. Most people never did. His cabin sat above the Klamath on a shoulder of cedar and tan oak, far enough from the county road that tourists never found it by accident. 8 years earlier, before the silence settled in for good, Diane had painted the kitchen cupboards a pale green and argued with him about where the pressure canner belonged. She said his system made no sense. He said her system was decorative chaos. They had laughed, moved the canner twice, and landed it exactly where she wanted in the first place. After she died, he kept everything useful and put away everything tender. He wasn't bitter about it. Bitter implied argument, and there was no one left to argue with. His days were built from tasks that did not care about his mood. Check the springboks for silt after heavy rain. Mend the elk fence where the posts leaned. Rotate canned stores by date, not guesswork. Sweep ash from the stovepipe elbow. Walk the trap camera line at dusk with 1 trekking pole, 1 old Glock in a chest holster, and the same measured pace he once used on handline. Steady enough to last all day, fast enough to mean business. Some weeks he spoke only to the radio weather band and the ravens. On Tuesdays, if he needed flour or lamp oil, he drove to Orleans, nodded at people in line, and paid cash. Nobody asked why a retired Forest Service man lived alone in a cabin with no internet and a freezer full of venison labelled by drainage and date. In that part of the county, privacy was still considered a form of manners. Every October, the week after the first real cold snap, he loaded his old green Tacoma and drove to Bluff Creek. Tourists called it a Bigfoot pilgrimage. Ray called it annual maintenance. He camped there for the same reason he had chosen fire for a career. It demanded full attention and offered no room for the kind of thoughts that circled uselessly at 3 a.m. Deep timber, wet ground, long waits. Listen, watch, catalogue. Whether or not the stories were true had never mattered much to him. What mattered was that the creek country was old, rough, and mostly honest. It made him feel employed again. By noon on the first day, he had his camp set in a small bench above the water, where second growth gave way to older fir. Not a campground, just a legal dispersed spot he had used off and on for 15 years. He pitched a wall tent low and tight, strung food high between 2 trunks, and ringed his fire with stone, scavenged from an older, collapsed pit that looked like it had been there since the Carter administration. He hung a steel mug from the table edge, set his medkit where his hand would find it blind, and tied reflective tape strips at knee height on 2 roots that had nearly tripped him in previous years. Routine first, then coffee. The first night passed easy. Owls in the drawer, drizzle around midnight, 1 blacktail buck ghosting the edge of his headlamp cone. He slept in wool socks, woke twice to pee, and lay awake once with Diane's name in his mouth like a word in a foreign language he could no longer pronounce correctly. On the second day, he hiked 3 miles up an old logging spur, swapped batteries in 2 cameras, found one with chew marks from a curious bear, and made it back before dark with his knee hot and stiff. He ate canned chili over coals and half a heel of sourdough, washed his spoon in boiled creek water, and sat on a folding stool with his coat zipped to his throat while fog eased in among the trunks. People imagined fear as a dramatic thing, heart pounding, eyes wild. But in the woods, most fear arrived as details. A jay that stopped scolding mid-note, a branch snapping once, and then not again. The peculiar sensation that the dark had weight. At 9:47 by his watch, as his fire collapsed into a red basin of coals, a scream ripped the night open from maybe 20 feet away. Not the bark yowl of a fox, not cougar caterwaul, not elk. This was high, raw, and close enough that he felt it in his molars. Ray was moving before he fully stood, headlamp on, hand to pistol, but not drawn. He swept left tree line first, then right, then the shadow under the Tacoma, then the hanging food line where bears sometimes tested knots by scent alone. No huffing breath, no click of claw on stone. No eyeshine except 2 raccoons 40 yards off, freezing like guilty mechanics. He stepped around the fire ring and found the dirt churned fresh. He had raked smooth mineral soil before dinner, an old smoke jumper habit for reading sign. Now it looked as if something heavy had paced tight circles around the pit, over and over, impressions layered atop impressions until edges blurred. Not hoof, not paw, not boot tread he recognized. Just broad depressions and dragged arcs in damp duff. He crouched, touched one with 2 fingers, still holding shape. Recent. The second scream came from directly below him. His body reacted first. He jumped back hard enough to bang his calf against the table leg. Then a wet thud sounded under the stone fire ring, deep and close, and his enamel mug hopped once and rattled to the ground. The earth inside the ring shivered. Not a quake, not imagination. The center of the old pit sank half an inch, rose again and sagged like soaked cardboard. In his headlamp beam the ash puffed and settled as if something exhaled beneath it. Ray swore under his breath and grabbed the shovel. He probed the center. The blade punched through on the second thrust with almost no resistance and dropped to the hilt. A void. He stopped there. Night digging in unknown ground with no backup and 1 bad knee was how men became rescue reports. He set the shovel across the ring, shoved 2 coolers over the soft patch as a marker, and backed away. For the next hour he sat in his truck cab with the doors locked. Engine off, window cracked enough to hear. Twice more the scream came, thinner each time, followed by frantic scrabble sounds and a low impact from underground that trembled through the bench. Once, from farther out in timber, came a single wooden knock, hollow, resonant, as if someone struck a dead trunk with a club. He did not sleep much. At 4:10 he made coffee on the tailgate by headlamp and watched fog bead on the windshield. When daylight finally filtered grey through cedar, he put on rain pants, taped his right ankle for support, and went to work. The stones came up one by one. Underneath lay a cap of crusted soil over rotted planks. Old pit trap, he thought immediately. Illegal, improvised, probably decades old. Maybe set for bareback when people did dumb things out of sight and called it subsistence. The cap had held by luck and habit until his fire heat and weight finished the collapse. He levered the last plank aside and looked down into a narrow sinkhole dropping 10 feet into a cramped chamber lined with blackened timbers and rusted hardware. Something moved. It flung itself against the far wall with a sound halfway between a cough and a shriek, long limbs striking mud, hair matted with clay. The headlamp from his chest caught a face for an instant, flat-nosed, broad-mouthed, eyes huge and white-ringed with panic. A juvenile, not human, not bear, not anything his training offered him a neat box for. A rusted cable snare looped above its right ankle, cinched tight enough to bite flesh. The other end disappeared through an eye bolt sunk into a timber brace. Every time it lunged, the cable sang and cut deeper. Ray had spent his whole adult life naming the practical thing in front of him. Crown fire, spot line, blow up, compound fracture. You named it, then you handled it. He stood very still, shovel handle in both hands, and said out loud to no one, "Well, hell." The answer came from the trees. A deep chest call rolled from uphill, not loud but felt, like a bass note through plywood. Then another from downslope. Then two rapid wood knocks behind his truck. Not echoes, separate sources, triangulating his little camp from three sides at least. He didn't point his light at them. He didn't spin or shout. He just listened, counting distance by delay and dampening. Close. Close enough for thrown debris. Close enough for charge range if they wanted it. In the pit, the juvenile screamed again and clawed mud, trying to climb the slick wall. It slipped, slammed down hard, and the cable jerked tight with a metallic snap. Ray flinched as if he felt it in his own ankle. He backed one step from the rim, then another, making his posture small, palms open. Old backcountry rule with stressed animals. Lower threat, reduce motion, by seconds. Rain began around noon, a fine, cold stitch that became steady within 20 minutes. Clay at the pit lip turned greasy. Water collected in the bottom faster than the old drain holes could take it, rising around the trapped creature's shins, then knees whenever it stopped thrashing long enough to stand. By dusk, if weather held, that hole would be a bathtub of mud. He did a fast inventory on the tailgate. One manual come-along rated for a ton. One bolt cutter with nicked jaws. 50 feet of paracord. 2 ratchet straps. One folding ladder too short by 4 feet. One retired smoke jumper with a repaired meniscus and no spotter. From timber came another chest call. Lower this time, then silence that felt deliberate. Ray looked toward the sound and spoke quietly, voice level like he was briefing a green crew. "I'm not leaving it." The woods gave no answer he could translate. He walked the perimeter, found firs stout enough to anchor rigging, and marked a path from tailgate to pit with orange survey tape for footing in rain. Every few minutes the juvenile cried out, hoarse now, ragged, but still fighting. Each cry hit him in the sternum, not because it was mysterious, because panic sounded the same in every species once you'd heard enough of it. What was at risk was simple and total. If he did nothing, it drowned or tore its leg to bone trying. If he rushed, he could fall in, get mauled, or trigger the adults into a defensive strike that would end with him broken in a mud hole no one would check for days. If he called authorities and told the full truth, he'd bring a circus into old timber that had survived better without people's certainty. If he lied completely, the trap would stay, and maybe others like it. He thought of Diane in her last month, when pain made her grip the bedrail and still, she apologized for making noise. He had stood beside her useless as weather, learning that love was sometimes just staying in the room when there was nothing to fix. The memory came sharp and unwelcome, and then, unexpectedly, useful. Endurance wasn't passive. Endurance was a job. Rain drummed harder on the truck roof. The pit water climbed another inch. Ray clipped the bolt cutter holster to his belt, cinched a rope around his waist, and tied the free end to a fir at shoulder height, where a hard fall wouldn't yank him backward into the void. He tested knots twice, then a third time. From the trees, unseen but near, something large shifted its weight. Branches whispered. A low, pulsing sound rose and fell, not a threat this time so much as a pressure in the air, as if the whole forest were holding one breath and waiting to see what he would do next. Ray moved. He stepped toward the sinkhole rim one boot length at a time, shoulders angled so he looked smaller, less squared. The juvenile saw him and detonated into motion, arms windmilling, back slamming timber, teeth bared in pure white flashes. Its scream knifed upwards so hard his ear canals ached. At the same instant, something in the trees to his right answered with a chest-deep bark that rattled needles from a branch. "Easy," Ray said, though he knew the word meant nothing. "Easy, kid. I see it." He crouched at the edge and studied the trap. The cable loop had bitten just above the ankle joint. Skin there was rubbed hairless, dark with blood and clay. The lock was old, a sliding ferrule with corrosion blooming orange along the seam. The anchor point looked worse, an eye bolt sunk through a rotting crossbeam that had once been solid enough to hold a 300-pound bear. Now, the beam had split. If the juvenile kept wrenching, the whole brace could fail and drop another section of wall inward. He eased back, grabbed the come-along from the tailgate, and clipped one hook to a ratchet strap around a live fir 15 feet from the pit. The other end he fed toward the hole with a length of paracord, trying to fish the hook down near the trapped cable without putting his torso over open dirt. 3 tries. 5. Each time the hook knocked timber and skittered away. Each clang sent the juvenile into another frenzy. Each frenzy called another answer from the trees. On his 7th try, a fist-thick alder branch whistled in from upslope and hit the mud 3 feet from his left boot. Not a wild throw, a warning shot. Ray straightened slowly, both hands open at shoulder level, head turning just enough to acknowledge the source without locking eyes he couldn't see. Rain mottled his coat. Water ran off his hat brim in steady drops. "Got it," he said into cedar and fog. Message received. No charge came. No second branch. But the air around camp tightened, occupied in every direction. He unbuckled the chest holster, drew the Glock, cleared it, and set both pistol and mag on the tailgate in plain view. Then he stepped away from the truck and kicked them gently under the rear tire where they stayed visible but out of his hands. "I don't need that," he said. The juvenile shrieked again, louder than before, then coughed wetly. It slipped, chin striking mud, and came up sputtering while the cable jerked hard enough to ring. Ray worked faster. He tied a loop knot in the paracord, snagged the snare cable above the lock, and ran that line through the come-along so he could take some tension off the trapped leg. Crank by crank, the ratchet clicked, and the cable lifted half an inch. The juvenile fought it anyway, but now each lunge didn't bite quite as deep. He gained maybe 2 inches of slack before the paracord began to smoke against rust. He stopped before it snapped. The rain changed character, from straight fall to slanted sheets driven under branches. The pit walls became grease. Mud sloughed off in skins, plopping into brown water that had climbed to mid-calf on the juvenile when it stood still. It no longer stood still. Ray set the short ladder at the edge, tested weight. It shifted immediately. He reset it against a fir root, jammed 2 stones at the feet, tested again. Better, but still wrong. 4 feet too short meant he'd be hanging by his arms for the last drop if he used it. 1 bad knee in slick clay, and no guarantee the lip wouldn't crumble under him. Another wood knock sounded from downhill, then a second from behind his tent. Coordinates, he thought automatically. Their passing position. He hated how quickly his body recognized the pattern as perimeter control. He took a breath, forced his pulse down, and checked his watch. 2:18 p.m. light would flatten early under this cloud. He had maybe 3 useful hours before headlamp work turned every motion into a gamble. "Okay," he said, mostly to himself. "Mechanical first." He dug in the truck bed, found an old fence post, and shaved one end with his belt knife to a blunt wedge. On the other end, he taped a loop of wire to make a crude guide hook. He lay flat on his belly, chest in wet duff, and lowered the pole into the hole, trying to catch the snare lock and hold it still long enough for a cut from above. The juvenile read the movement as attack and launched upward. Its hand, longer than his forearm, black mud in the creases, slapped the pole and ripped it from his grip. The post clattered down, struck water, and jammed crosswise against the wall. The juvenile screamed and bit at the cable near its own ankle, jaws working blindly. Blood feathered in the muddy water. Ray swore, rolled back from the edge, and sat breathing hard on his heels. From the trees came no taunting sound, no triumph, just that same low pulse, nearer now, almost subvocal. He couldn't place direction. It seemed to come from everywhere, damp and green at once. He wiped rain from his face and stood. "You want this done," he said softly. "Then you let me do it." A long silence answered. Then, from upslope, one measured knock. He took it as permission because he needed to take something as permission. By 3:30, his gloves were soaked through and his fingers had gone stiff in the joints. He'd rigged a second line, paracord doubled, backed by a ratchet strap, to the eye bolt itself, hoping to stabilize the anchor beam before it failed. The first pull held. The second tore a fist-sized chunk of rotten timber free and nearly dragged him into the hole. He dropped flat, boots scrabbling for purchase, and felt the lip collapse under his left shin with a sound like tearing cardboard. He rolled clear just ahead of a slurry slide that dumped 2 shovelfuls of mud directly onto the juvenile's shoulders. It came up roaring. The scream that followed was no longer high. It had dropped register from strain and fear, a ragged sawtooth sound that made Ray think of calves bawling in shoot crush, of men in burn tents biting through morphine fog. The creature thrashed and went under to the chin. Water now sat above its knees between panics. He scanned his options again and hated all of them. The come-along could maybe haul the juvenile up if he got a proper harness under its torso. He had no harness and no way to place one from above without getting his arm taken off. A tranquilizer would have solved half the problem. He had ibuprofen, duct tape, and a bad attitude. Digging a ramp in this rain would take hours and likely collapse the chamber. Leaving until morning was a death sentence. He limped to the tent, yanked open the duffel, and found his old climbing harness from search and rescue volunteer days, stiff with age but intact. He checked stitching. Serviceable. He added a locking carabiner, 2 Prusik loops, and the last 20 feet of static line he kept for hauling deer quarters. As he stepped back into camp, a shape moved between 2 firs at the edge of visibility. Tall, barrel-chested, gone in one smooth transfer of shadow. Not imagination this time, not suggestion. Mass-displaced space, and then was absent. Ray did not chase it with his eyes. Predators read fixation as intent. He kept working, loud enough to be heard. "I'm going down there if I can't get this from top," he said. "If I go down, he bites, I bleed. Everybody understands?" Something answered from downhill, a chest call, short and clipped. He took that as yes because, again, he needed yes. He staged gear in order on the tailgate. Line, cutters, spare gloves, trauma kit open to gauze and tape. He stripped off his wet jacket and replaced it with waxed canvas, thicker in the forearms. Over that, he taped a folded section of sleeping pad around his left wrist as an improvised bite guard. Clumsy, but better than skin. The rain found every gap anyway. At 4 o'clock, a new problem arrived. Cold. Not dramatic hypothermia, just that creeping drain where judgment frays at edges. His hands began dropping small things, carabiner once, knife twice. He caught himself staring at a knot without remembering what knot it should be. He forced a pause, drank hot water from a thermos, ate 2 jerky strips he couldn't taste, and did a full self-check out loud like on Old Incidents. Name Ray Reynolds. Date October 10th. Location Bluff Creek Bench. Objective free trapped juvenile. Risks fall, bite, confrontation, exposure. Mitigation rope, anchors, slow movement, no sudden turns. Saying it reset him. Procedure was a rail you could hold when the ground tilted. A crack snapped from the woods behind his truck. He turned. An arm-length stick had been planted upright in the mud beside his tire, sharpened end down, as neatly as a survey flag. He hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't seen motion. One moment, empty space. Next moment, marker. Not threat, he realized after a beat. Direction. The stick pointed, unmistakably, toward the pit. His scalp prickled. "Yeah," he murmured. "I know where the problem is." The juvenile's cries weakened, spacing out. That scared him more than the screaming. He crawled to the rim and called down in the same calm cadence he'd used on trapped stock for decades. "Hey, stay with me. Don't check out. Keep your head up." The creature blinked mud from one eye and stared straight at him, panting. For a second, it stopped fighting. In that second, he saw how young it was, shoulders not yet fully broadened, canines long but not adult thick, fingers too fine-boned for the hulking silhouettes in the timber. Then thunder rolled somewhere west, and panic took it again. Water surged around its thighs. Ray set the harness around his own waist and clipped in. "All right," he said, voice flat with decision. "No more rehearsal." He had just shouldered the rope when movement caught his left peripheral vision. Slow, deliberate, close enough to hear wet leaves compress. A large figure stepped to the edge of camp and stopped at the same stump where he usually set his lantern. Not fully in the open. Enough. It was female, he knew instantly from body geometry, even through rain and distance. Wider pelvis, heavy chest, less blocky shoulder than the males he had glimpsed in old tracks, and one bad game camera frame years back. She stood maybe 7.5 feet, dark fur plastered in ropes by rain, face broad and flat with deep-set eyes that did not blink often enough to look human. She did not bare teeth, did not hunch, did not advance. She bent, placed something on the stump with 2 careful fingers, and stepped back into shadow. Ray stayed still so long rain pooled at his collar. On the stump lay a red bandana, cleanly folded into a square. Diane's. He knew it by the faded white paisley in one corner where bleach had splashed years ago and left a crescent mark like a thin moon. He had kept it in the top flap of his pack since she got sick, sometimes around his neck on windy days, sometimes tied to a branch at camp as a marker. Last night, when he'd reached for it to wipe the mug, it had been gone. He'd assumed he dropped it on trail or left it at home. Not dropped, taken, returned. He walked to the stump slowly, every muscle waiting for impact that never came. The bandana was damp but mostly clean, as if rinsed in creek water and wrung by hand. No mud, no blood. Fold edges aligned with absurd precision. He picked it up and felt, for one dizzy second, the old kitchen light at home. Diane laughing with paint on her forearm, saying he folded towels like military orders. The memory landed clean instead of cutting. From the pit came another scream, and before he could move, the female gave a low, 2-part vocalization. Woo-uh, soft but resonant, almost felt more than heard. The juvenile went still. Not calm, not comfortable, but less wild, like a switch had lowered from red to amber. Its breathing slowed enough for words to fit between gasps. The female repeated the call when the juvenile began to thrash again. Again it paused. Ray looked from the stump to the hole to the line of trees, where at least 2 more shapes now stood, just inside visibility, motionless sentries in rain. The whole pattern reorganized in his head with a click. They had not ringed his camp to hunt him. They had ringed it to contain him. Keep him on task. Keep him from running. Keep other dangers out while he handled the one thing they couldn't. Steel cable and rusted lock and rigging that needed thumbs and tools. Pressed into service. He tied Diane's bandana around his neck, not for sentiment in that moment, but because it kept his throat warm and because he wanted them to see he understood the exchange. Then he faced the trees and spoke, loud enough to carry through rain. "I'm going in," he said. "You keep him listening to you, and I'll get the wire off." The female answered with that same low pulse. Once. Agreement, maybe, or simply acknowledgement. It was enough. For the first time in 8 years, Ray felt his patience point somewhere other than surviving until dark. He checked his knots one last time, clipped the bolt cutters to his belt, and walked back to the pit as the rain hammered down and the forest held its breath around him. He planted his boots at the rim, tested the rope once with his full weight, and swung his legs over. Mud sheared away under his heels immediately. He dropped the first 3 feet too fast, caught himself on the line, and felt his left knee flash hot enough to make him grunt. The juvenile exploded at the motion, hands slapping water, shoulders hammering timber, and from the trees came a hard, concussive bark that felt less like fear than command. "Hold!" Ray snapped, not sure who he was talking to. He pendulumed against the wall, found a rotten brace with his right boot, and rode the rope down until muddy water swallowed his shins. The hole smelled like iron, rot, and old animal panic baked into wood grain. Up close, the cable wasn't just rusted, it was laminated with years of silt and hair and corrosion, as if the trap had eaten and waited, and eaten again. The juvenile lunged for his face. Ray jammed his forearm across its upper chest and turned his head, taking the impact on canvas and padded wrist instead of throat. Teeth scraped, found no purchase, slid off. He shoved down and sideways, Stockman leverage, shoulder into sternum, and pinned it against the wall long enough to get eyes on the lock. Too low. Underwater half the time, hidden by churn. He barked upward. "Slack!" No one answered in words, but the rope around his waist twitched as one of his top anchors settled, taking load. He shifted, got one hand to the cable, and felt for the ferrule seam with numb fingers. The juvenile screamed directly into his ear, spittle and rain mixing on his cheek. Then the antagonist made its move. Not a creature, not a person. The hill itself. The rain had been soaking this bench all day. Now the pit lip on the truck side gave way in a slab, and 40 pounds of mud and stone avalanched into the chamber. One rock the size of a bowling ball struck the crossbeam over the anchor eye bolt with a crack that echoed like a rifle shot. The beam sagged 2 inches. The cable went guitar string tight around the juvenile's ankle. It shrieked and twisted. Ray felt tendons jump under wet fur where his forearm pinned it. If the beam failed, that steel noose would yank with whatever angle gravity chose. Ankle, knee, maybe hip, tearing things that didn't come back right. From uphill, branches thrashed. A male shape hit the edge of camp full speed, stopped short at the rim, and slammed both fists into a cedar trunk. The tree shuddered. Another male answered from downslope with a chest roll that raised gooseflesh on Ray's neck, despite the cold. Perimeter control had become countdown. Ray looked once at the collapsing lip, once at the juvenile's leg, and saw stakes with no room for self-deception. If he lost this hole now, he didn't just lose an animal. He lost whatever narrow truce was keeping 3 adults from ripping him apart. He lost his own way out. He might lose the only evidence that old poacher Steele was still killing things out here, long after the hands that set it were gone. "Back!" he yelled up at the male on the rim. "You drop in here, we all die." The male bared teeth, not in a human grin, but a raw warning line. He grabbed a root bundle and yanked. More dirt rained down, peppering Ray's shoulders, turning water opaque. The juvenile bucked at every impact. Panic, compounding panic. Then, from the timber behind the rim, the female gave that two-note call. Woo-ah, louder now, edged like wire pulled tight. The male froze. He did not retreat, but he stopped tearing at the slope. His breath plumed in bursts. His eyes stayed on Ray with a hatred so focused, it felt physical. Ray used the 3 seconds she bought him. He unclipped the bolt cutters from his belt, shoved one handle under the cable to find position by feel, and squeezed. Nothing. Jaws slipped on rust scale and skated off. The recoil smashed his knuckles into timber. Pain flared. He reset, deeper angle, both hands on the grips, knee braced into mud. Above him, the beam creaked again. Longer this time. A wet, fibrous complaint as the wood fibers started to go. He squeezed until tendons in his forearm trembled and the world narrowed to steel on steel. A single strand inside the cable snapped with a tiny ping. Not enough. The juvenile convulsed at the vibration and drove its shoulder into his jaw. Light burst white behind his eyes. The cutters jerked free, spun once, and vanished into the brown water at their feet. Ray swore so hard he tasted blood. He had built the whole plan on one tool. One. And now, the whole had it. He got out ugly, not by strength, by stubborn geometry. One hand on rope, one forearm shielding his face while the juvenile fought beneath him. Boots searching for holds that dissolved under weight. Twice, he slid back to waist depth. Once he banged his bad knee against the crossbeam and almost blacked out. The third time he caught a fir root, locked his elbow over it, and rolled onto the bench like a landed fish. He lay there in rain for maybe 20 seconds, chest hitching, before training forced him upright. Control bleeding. Inventory. Breathe. His left wrist was open along the ulna where teeth had finally found seam between pad and glove. Not arterial, but deep enough to leak steadily. He clamped gauze, wrapped pressure tape one-handed, and cinched it with his teeth. By the time he finished, his fingers had gone clumsy and white at the tips. Below, the juvenile kept screaming, thinner now, every cry ending in a wet cough. Ray crawled to the edge and peered down. Water had climbed to upper thigh. The cutters were gone, swallowed in chocolate slurry and debris. The snare cable sang each time the trapped leg jerked, a high, sick note he'd hear for years, if they both lived through this. He sat back on his heels and let doubt hit him full. He had no second bolt cutter. The hacksaw in his truck toolbox had a 6-inch blade and no room to stroke in that cramped mud bath. Shooting the cable was fantasy and ricochet suicide. Pulling the eye bolt out might take the leg with it. Calling for help now meant 20 minutes to find enough signal on ridge, then hours at best before anyone arrived, maybe with questions he could not answer and lights that would fracture this clearing into violence. He pressed his taped wrist under his armpit to slow the bleed and looked at the red bandana at his throat, now dark with rain and mud. For one bad minute he considered walking away. Not forever, just to the truck, just to heat, dry gloves, maybe clearer thought. But he knew what that was, a polite name for quitting. By the time he came back, the water would be higher and his courage lower. The male from the rim dropped to all fours 10 yards off and advanced 2 paces, lips peeled. Ray didn't reach for a weapon he no longer wore. He simply met the stare, exhausted and plain. "I know," he said. "I know." The male roared, short, explosive, and slapped the ground hard enough to throw mud. Ray flinched despite himself. In the trees behind that aggression, the female's low pulse sounded again, quicker this time, almost frantic. Not command. Fear. Ray followed the sound and saw her shape partly visible between cedars, shoulders hunched, hands flexing open and shut. She kept looking from him to the pit, from the pit to the sky, as if counting something he had also begun counting. Minutes of daylight, inches of water, fibers left in a rotten beam. He forced himself back into procedure. Tool retrieval, he muttered through chattering teeth. Then cut. He grabbed the shaved fence post he'd lost earlier, found the wire loop end still taped, and began probing blindly in the pit water from above. Every thrust hit timber, mud, or empty swirl. No steel click, no handle. He changed angle, slowed, swept in arcs like magnet fishing without a magnet. 6 minutes. Nothing. 9. Nothing. At 12, the wire loop snagged something heavy. He lifted. The resistance moved, then stuck. He eased tension, rotated his wrist, and brought up not cutters, but a clotted mass of old trap chain and hair that might have been decades old. It stank like wet pennies and death. He dropped it and swallowed hard against bile. His hands started shaking from cold and blood loss. He jammed the pole aside and sat back, rain running down the bridge of his nose. Around camp, the ring of watchers tightened by yards, not feet. He could feel them without seeing all of them. Weight shifts, breath, the occasional muted knock, transmitted trunk to trunk like code. If trust broke now, he wouldn't have time to rebuild it. For the first time since stepping into the hole, he felt small in a way fire never made him feel. "I can't do this," he whispered. He hated hearing it in his own voice. The female answered with a sound he hadn't heard yet, a low, wavering moan, almost human in its cracked grief. It rose once and broke. The male stopped posturing. Even the juvenile's thrashing paused as if listening upward to that note. Ray closed his eyes. When he opened them, his doubt hadn't vanished. It had simply been assigned a place behind the next task. He stood, swayed, caught himself on the table and went to find another way. In the trees, the female shifted her weight from one foot to the other and tasted iron on the rein. The old male wanted the 2-leg gone. She could smell it in him, hot, sharp, full of fight and old scar memory. He had lost a brother 3 cold seasons ago to wire at a salt lick near the burned ridge, found too late, leg black and split. Since then, steel scent meant rage, man shape meant threat, but the trapped one in the hole was hers. She remembered him in spring light clinging to her side with milk teeth and sleep-heavy eyes. Remembered the first time he followed juveniles to the creek and came back with leeches on his ankles, outraged and proud. Remembered this morning's scream-splitting fog, and the moment she saw his leg bound by snake metal she could not break, her own hands too broad, nails too blunt, strength useless against a lock made for fingers and tools. She had sent calls across drainages, pulled kin close, circled the 2-legs camp all night. When he stayed instead of fleeing, she took cloth from his den smell pile to read him. Human scent lay deep in it. Smoke, soap, old grief, a female long gone but still present like dry leaves in fur. She had washed the cloth in creek and gave it back, an offering the only way she knew. Now the rain climbed. Water sound in the pit changed pitch. Time thinned. She watched the 2-leg bleed and keep moving. Watched him set down his tooth thunder weapon where he could not grab it. Watched him speak not with dominance, not with prey panic, but with work voice. The same cadence elders used when easing a thorn from a child's foot while the child screamed and kicked. She feared him. She needed him. Both sat in her chest without settling. When she gave the broken moan, it was not strategy. It was the sound that had escaped her when she found her brother dead in wire. She had not meant to make it now, but it came, and the clearing heard the truth inside it. The old male lowered his head. Not surrender. Recognition. She moved one step closer to the rim, open hands visible, and made the two-note call again for the one in the pit. Steady, 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 though her own breath shook. If the two-leg failed, she would go into the hole herself and tear until bone gave. If that killed the young, she would carry him out anyway. If the old male struck the two-leg before the cable broke, she would strike the old male and split the family to save one child. Rain ran from her brow ridge, warm, then cold. She did not wipe it away. Ray found the cutters by accident. He'd gone to the tailgate for the small pry bar, thinking maybe he could shear the eye bolt from above, when his hand brushed the recovery magnet he kept for dropped screws around the wood stove at home. A puck magnet on 20 feet of cord. Barely stronger than a bad idea for this job. Still, steel was steel. He tied the magnet line to his belt as backup, dropped to his belly at the rim again, and fed it into the pit in slow circles. First pass, nothing. Second, silt. Third, a faint tap transmitted up the cord like a knuckle on a door. He held breath, lifted an inch, felt drag, then wait. The magnet surfaced with one bolt cutter handle clinging by mud and luck. He hauled hand over hand, teeth clenched, until the tool broke water and banged the wall. One jaw was bent slightly outward. The hinge pin ground when he opened it. Usable, maybe. Maybe once. He spat mud, laughed once, more bark than humor, and checked the sky. Dusk was flattening everything to charcoal. Under tree cover, it looked like full dark already. Then the final move came. A crack, like a snapped 2x4, split the clearing. The crossbeam in the pit wall dropped another 4 inches. The anchor eye bolt tore half free, twisting the snare cable into a new angle that yanked the juvenile sideways underwater to the shoulder. It came up choking, one eye rolling white. Simultaneously, the creek below camp, swollen by the storm, changed tone from chatter to roar. Backflood began pushing through whatever old drainage tunnel fed this trap chamber. Brown water surged in from beneath the far wall in pulses, each one higher. The pit was becoming a cistern. Damn it! He didn't finish. No time. The old male rushed the rim again, this time not stopping. He dropped to one knee at the edge and reached down toward the juvenile with a hand broad as a shovel, trying to grab and pull. The cable tightened to violin wire, cutting deeper. The juvenile screamed and thrashed harder, nearly wrenching the half-freed eye bolt completely loose. "No!" Ray shouted. The female slammed into the male's shoulder from the side. Not full fight, but enough to knock his reach off target. He spun on her with a roar. She answered with a blast of sound that froze him in place for 1 heartbeat. 2. Ray used both heartbeats. He jammed the warped cutters through his belt, clipped rope to harness, and tied in with hands that barely obeyed. He reset the primary anchor lower on the fur to reduce swing, added a backup around the table frame, and looped a Prusik above his descender, because if his grip failed now, he was dead before he hit bottom. He looked once at the female. She held his gaze, chest heaving, and gave the 2-note call down into the hole. The juvenile went rigid, listening through terror. Ray stepped over the rim into rain, and rising dark as the beam groaned, water surged, and the whole bench seemed to tilt toward catastrophe. Ray hit mud and cold water hard enough to splash his own face. The chamber had changed in the last 2 minutes. What had been thigh-deep churn was now a swirling brown waste pool with debris rolling through it. Sticks, bark strips, old hair clots, one rusted trap spring spinning like a drowned insect. The juvenile was half sideways against the wall, right leg pinned by the cable, left foot skidding for purchase on nothing. Ray slammed his shoulder into the youngster's ribs and drove it upright before the next pulse of backflood shoved both of them under. "Breathe," he barked into its wet fur. "You breathe." Above, silhouettes crowded the rim. The old male snarled and beat the ground. The female's two-note call punched down through rain. Woo-ah, steady, then again. The juvenile trembled under Ray's forearm but stopped windmilling long enough for him to get one look at the lock. The corroded ferrule sat 3 inches above the ankle, half hidden by mud and blood. Cable strands were splitting where the eye bolt had twisted. If he missed and cut flesh, the water would hide it until it was too late. He wedged the cutter jaws around the cable and squeezed. The bent hinge skipped. Jaws slipped, shrieked across steel, and slammed shut on empty water. The juvenile exploded at the noise and twisted to bite. Ray turned his torso on instinct, taking the bite on his left wrist guard. Teeth punched through canvas, sleeping pad, and into meat anyway. White fire shot up his forearm. He saw stars. He did not let go. "Take it!" he hissed through clenched teeth. "Go ahead, I'm not moving." Above, the female called again, lower, almost vibrato. The juvenile's jaw loosened a fraction. Ray ripped his wrist free, blood blooming through tape, and reseated the cutters with both hands. He had no leverage in the water, so he changed angle. One handle jammed against the timber wall, the other braced against his thigh, body weight driving the close. He pushed. Cable creaked. Nothing. He reset deeper, found one broken strand like a starter notch, and crushed down until his shoulders shook. Ping. One more strand gave. Not enough. The beam overhead groaned and dropped another inch. Mud from the ceiling peppered his neck. Backflood hit again, higher, nearly knocking him sideways. Water lapped the juvenile's lower chest now. If the beam failed, the lock would yank down and hold the youngster under. Third time, Ray said to himself, to Diane, to whatever listened in old timber. Third time does it. He slid his forearm across the juvenile's collarbones, pinning shoulders the way he'd held calves in branding shoots decades ago. Not cruelty, not gentleness, just firm enough to keep everybody alive. The youngster thrashed once, twice, then froze under pressure and the female's call. Ray took one breath, set the warped jaws exactly on the rust seam, and bore down with everything left in his back and hips. For a heartbeat, the world was only grip, steel, pain. Then the cable snapped with a gunshot crack. The severed end whipped his cheek and opened a line of heat from ear to jaw. The juvenile jolted free so fast he nearly lost his footing. It kicked off his chest, clawed the wall, and scrambled toward the slope where collapsed mud had formed a greasy ramp. Twice it slid back. Third attempt it found root, launched, and vanished past the rim in a spray of clay and cedar needles. Ray stayed where he was, bent over, hands on knees, water punching his thighs. He heard the old male roar above, then shift into a different sound, short, sharp barks that rose and broke. Not triumph exactly. Release with teeth in it. The chamber gave a final warning groan. Ray looked up. The crossbeam bowed like wet cardboard. "Not here," he muttered. He clipped his descender, grabbed rope with his good hand, and started climbing. His bad knee failed on the first push, buckling in mud. He slammed chest first into the wall, coughed water, reset feet. "Come on," he said. "Move, old man, move." He gained 2 feet, lost 1, gained 3. At the rim, a dark hand the size of a shovel reached down from the rain. The old male. Ray's whole body locked. One wrong interpretation and he'd die touching that hand or refusing it. The male's fingers opened, palm up, then closed once. Impatient, Ray made a choice that had no room for debate. He looped his rope over one forearm, raised his right arm and gripped the offered wrist. The pull almost dislocated his shoulder. The male hauled him clear like a sack, then released him so abruptly he rolled onto his back in the mud. At the same instant, the sinkhole chamber collapsed. The center of the old pit dropped in with a deep, sucking boom, swallowing water, timbers, rope tail, and 50 years of rusted death into a widening brown moor. Rain hammered down, steam from breath and earth mixed in the headlamp beam. Ray rolled to his side and pushed up on one elbow, blinking mud from his eyes. The female stood 6 feet away. Up close, she was immense, yes, but the first thing he noticed was not size. It was smell. Wet earth, alder sap, musk, and creekstone. Her fur lay in roped black strands over muscle and scar tissue. One old scar crossed her left forearm, pale where hair never regrew. Her eyes were dark amber, set under a heavy brow, and fixed on him with a steadiness he had seen only in people who had sat beside hospital beds and known exactly what was at stake. She could have ended him before he inhaled again. Instead, she stepped once, close enough that rain bouncing off her shoulder hit his face, lowered her head, and drew one long breath that fluttered the red bandana at his throat. Then she gave the 2-note call, soft as wool pulled over wood. The forest answered. One by one, chest calls faded, knocks ceased. Even the old male dropped his posture, though he watched Ray with hard, unblinking warning. Ray nodded once, small. "He made it," he said, voice raw. "You got him." The female held his gaze another heartbeat, then turned and moved uphill in 3 silent strides that should not have been possible for something that large. Shadows took her. The old male followed. Branches shivered, then nothing but rain. Ray stayed in the mud until shivering became violent enough to force action. He stumbled through the mechanics of survival by muscle memory. Strip-wet outer shell. Dry base layer from duffel. Tourniquet? No. Bleed-controlled. Repack wrist wound with clean gauze. Steri-strip cheek lash. Splint fingers 2 and 3 where the old cutter recoil had swollen knuckles to purple knobs. Fire now, even in rain. He shaved cedar from a split log under tarp, fed flame with hexamine tab, then wrist-thick fur, then arm-thick. Heat came reluctantly, then all at once. At some point he realized he was talking out loud in incident cadence again. Hypothermia mild, bleeding moderate, no syncope, no immediate pursuit risk. No immediate pursuit risk. He laughed once at that, short and cracked. The antagonists were not gone yet. They had just changed shape. The storm escalated through full dark. Wind pushed rain under the tarp and drove sparks sideways. The newly collapsed pit on the edge of camp kept sloughing in wet sighs, each one a reminder that the ground itself was unstable. Twice more he heard movement uphill, heavy, then light, then gone. Watchers still there, maybe checking on the juvenile, maybe checking on him. Around midnight, the pain in his wrist deepened from sharp to throbbing hot. Infection risk ticked in his head like a metronome. Bite wound, mud contamination, field clean only. He swallowed antibiotics from his med kit, leftovers from a dental procedure, not ideal but better than wishful thinking, and forced down broth though nausea sat high in his throat. When wind lulled, he heard something else, whimpering, distant but distinct, moving uphill through timber. Juvenile, alive. "Good," he said into the fire. "Keep moving." At 2 a.m., a branch landed beside the tarp, not thrown hard, just dropped. Fresh-cut willow, stripped of leaves. 10 minutes later, another, then a third. He stared at them, too tired to pass. Finally, he realized they were laying a line. Markers angling away from the collapsed pit toward firmer ground on the uphill side of camp. An evacuation route. He packed before dawn, every movement stiff and slow. He left the fire ring cold, scattered coals, loaded wet canvas, and cut his rope free where it had fused into sinkhole mud. On impulse, he coiled the snapped snare cable and set it on the table, then changed his mind and put it in a contractor bag in the truck bed. Evidence, not trophy. When grey morning seeped in, the bench looked abandoned by weather and work. No bodies, no shapes in timber. Just broad prints layered in mud leading uphill, snapped willow switches marking the safer path, and the crater where the old trap had finally eaten itself. Ray stood at the edge of camp and listened. From far ridge, too far to triangulate clearly, came two measured knocks. He did not answer with his own knock. He answered the way he knew best, by listening until the sound faded on its own. The Ranger District office in Orleans smelled like wet wool, copier toner, and burnt coffee. Ray stood at the public counter in a borrowed flannel, the only dry shirt left in his truck, while a young seasonal with a lip ring stared at his bandaged wrist and tried not to stare at the mud in the creases of his face. "You need law enforcement or just hazard report?" she asked. "Hazard," Ray said. "Sinkhole collapse on dispersed bench above Bluff Creek. Old illegal trap hardware present. Unstable ground. Could swallow a camp if somebody sets up there." She looked up sharply. "Trap hardware as in current?" "As in old and still lethal." He slid a written map across the counter with bearings, creek bend, and a flagged ingress route sketched in neat block print. "There may be more in adjacent drainages. I can mark likely sites if you want." The district recreation tech, Morales, came out from the back with reading glasses fogged from coffee steam. "Ray Reynolds?" "Yep." Morales took one look at him and lowered his voice. "You run into people out there?" Ray held his eyes. "I ran into bad steel and bad ground. People could get hurt." Morales waited, maybe for embellishment. Ray gave him none. After a beat, Morales nodded. "All right, we'll post temporary closure till we can assess. You okay to see clinic for that arm?" "Already headed." At the door, Morales called after him. "You always come back from October looking like hell, Ray, but this is new." Ray gave half a smile that hurt his cheek stitches. Maintenance year was rough. He drove straight to urgent care in Hooper, took a tetanus shot, accepted a proper antibiotic course, and lied blandly about feral dog bite while clearing debris. The nurse looked unconvinced, but professional. By late afternoon, he was back on the county road climbing toward his cabin, windshield wipers ticking metronomic time. Cedar darkened in rain. Smoke from his own chimney was absent because he hadn't been home to light it. The place looked exactly as he'd left it, and not at all the same. Inside, he set the red bandana on the kitchen table and stood staring at it until the room stopped swaying. Then he did something he had not done since Diane's funeral. He opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside were her things he had labelled later 8 years ago and never touched. A knit cap with one loose thread, recipe cards in her slanted hand, a scarf that still held a ghost of lavender soap, and an old digital voice recorder she had used when chemo fog made writing hard. He carried the recorder to the table, sat down, and thumbed the power button. The battery icon blinked red, then steady. File list scrolled by dates from her last winter. He chose one at random and pressed play. Static, a cough, then Diane's voice, thinner than he remembered, amused anyway. "Ray, if you're listening to this, it means you finally opened the damn box. Took you long enough." His breath hitched like he'd been punched. On the recorder, she kept going. "I know you. You'll turn grief into chores because chores obey. But listen to me, Jumper. Surviving is not the same as living. Don't make a shrine out of being alone. It is not noble, it is lazy in a work shirt." He barked a wet laugh and put his good hand over his eyes. "You are so loved," her recorded voice said, suddenly soft. "By me, yes, obviously. Also by every fool who ever followed you down a fire break because you never lied about the heat. Let someone in, Raymond. Not to replace me. Nobody replaces anybody. Just let your life stay inhabited." The file clicked off. The cabin hummed with refrigerator motor and rain on metal roof. Ray sat very still, thumb resting on replay, then pressed it again and listened all the way through without moving. When it ended the second time, he spoke into the empty kitchen like she was leaning in the doorway with paint on her forearm. "Okay," he said. "I heard you." His voice roughened. "I don't know how to do that graceful. You knew that." He swallowed, looked at the bandana, and kept going. "But I can do it practical. One call at a time. One door. One more chair at the table. That I can do." The phone on the wall had dust on the handset. He wiped it with his sleeve, dialed from memory, and waited through 3 rings. "Morales," came the voice. "It's Ray, about those trap sweeps. I'm in if you'll issue me volunteer paperwork and a radio checkout." A pause. "You sure?" "Yeah." Another pause, softer. "Good, we can use your eyes." Ray nodded to no one. "Also, put me down for community briefing night next Thursday. I'll talk illegal hardware identification." He hung up before he could overthink it. Then he pulled out the chair across from him, the one he never used anymore, set a second mug on the table, and poured coffee into both. One for him. One for memory, yes, but also for practice. For a house becoming a house again. 2 weeks later, rain held off for one clear morning over Bluff Creek. Ray and Morales hiked a side drainage with orange flagging, bolt cutters, and contractor bags. Morales did the paperwork photos. Ray did the reading, subtle trail funnels, old game paths narrowed by human interference, the unnatural straight line of cable half buried in duff that only appears once you train your eye to hate it. By noon they had pulled 3 snares, 1 spring pole rig, and a rusted hook line tangled under alder roots. None recent, all still dangerous. At the second site, Morales knelt by a cable knot and shook his head. Who does this and just leaves it? People who think consequences have a statute of limitations, Ray said. He clipped the cable, coiled it, bagged it. On the hike out, they stopped at the old bench closure sign. Fresh mud had settled. Fern fronds were already reaching into disturbed soil. If you didn't know, you might not notice the place had nearly swallowed a life. Ray stood there a moment longer than necessary. From the ridge above came a single knock, then another, measured, not hidden. Morales frowned. "Hear that?" "Yep," Ray said. "Camper with an axe?" "Could be." Morales peered upslope, saw nothing, and shrugged. "Let's move. I want these logged before dark." "Right behind you." That night at the cabin, Ray wrote in a new field notebook by lantern light. Temp, 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind light northeast. Crescent moon. 2 knocks, 1942 from Upper Ridge. No screams in camp. Corridor active uphill after storms. He capped the pen, set it beside the old trap camera batteries charging on the counter, and stepped out onto the porch. The Klamath Valley lay black and silver under cold stars. Somewhere far off, a barred owl called once. Then, faint and deliberate from the ridgeline beyond his spring box, came 2 knocks spaced like a heartbeat. Ray did not call back. He did not need to. He leaned on the porch post, bandaged wrist warm in his pocket, and listened until the night folded the sound into itself.